Vegans can sound kinda crazy sometimes.
And when I see babies in a stroller, especially when they're crying, I just want to put my foot through the fucking thing and step on it until it's nothing but blood and pulp on the fucking pavement!
But at other times, they sound like they might be onto something.
Do you show the people that come to your farm things like the artificial insemination? Do you show them what happens to the calves? Do you show them the pens they're kept in for up to 8 weeks at a time where they're not allowed to see their mums, they're not allowed to nurture, they're not allowed to socialise? Do you take them to the slaughterhouse as well and show the knife being pulled across their throat? Or do you keep that bit hidden and just show kind of the cows grazing and being fed?
I want to show you the philosophical rabbit hole that has turned my world upside down and at times kept me awake at night. But before we go into any of that, I need to introduce you to a new word. Speciesism. A prejudice or bias in favour of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. Now, if I'd have heard that 10 years ago, I might have said something like,
yes, I'm a speciesist, okay? You got me. What are you?
I mean, it sounds like some crazy made-up word. But all words are made up.
That's correct.
Although, this one in particular sounds like a very weird idea. And most weird ideas don't make sense. But I've learned some things that have completely changed my mind about speciesism. And today, I want to share it all with you. Let's start off by talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson's new book. I was reading Neil deGrasse Tyson's Starry Messenger, and as I was reading, the following 3 thoughts passed through my mind. 1, wow, Neil likes to talk about a lot of different topics, from beauty to gender identity, to race issues, to law and human physiology. 2, oh cool, he talks about speciesism. He wrote, the urge to treat one species of animal differently in any way is called speciesism. And 3, that doesn't make any sense. If it's speciesist to treat one species of animal differently to another in any way, then it would be speciesist to feed 2 different species with different diets, even if their health and well-being required different diets. That would be like saying that it's sexist to treat biological men and women differently in any way. No, I don't need the right to an abortion and biological women don't need access to prostate exams. Clearly there can be good reasons for treating different beings differently. Like, I don't know, maybe they have different needs. If speciesism is pointing to some kind of unjustified discrimination or prejudice that's analogous to the other isms, then it has to be saying something more than, hey, you're treating 2 different species differently. Because if that is all it's saying, then okay, you got me, I'm a speciesist. There's this misconception that rejecting speciesism entails treating all animals exactly the same. But just as anti-sexists aren't saying that men need the right to an abortion, and anti-ageists aren't saying that infants need the right to drive, well, anti-speciesists aren't saying that pigs need the right to vote. The point is that Neil deGrasse Tyson's definition of speciesism is actually just a common misconception about what speciesism is. While we're on the topic of misconceptions, the most common misconception is that anti-speciesists are saying that all life has equal value.
All life is precious. And that idea changed me, it brought me back, and it keeps me living.
That if there were a fire and you could only save either the human or the mosquito, then they wouldn't necessarily favour the human. Actually, the anti-speciesist would want to save the human, but not because they happen to belong to the same species, but because the human has a stronger interest in avoiding the fire. And I'll get more into that properly later. I just need to have a coffee first. But for now, just know that rejecting speciesism doesn't entail dropping the intuition that a human life is more valuable than a fly. So I decided to make a community post. Vegans, what is speciesism? Let me know down below. And it worked. A bunch of people left comments. The only problem is that, nobody seems to agree. I took those replies to mean that there isn't really a common agreed upon definition, even among vegans. So I decided that I should just read the literature myself. And there's a lot. Okay, so anti-speciesists are saying that just like someone's age, race, or sex isn't a good reason for treating someone worse, neither is their species.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
The thing is, if we had a time machine to go back into the past, we would constantly find people who had views that we now find repugnant.
Look at your hair. Look at that blouse. And the way that skirt hangs. And those socks. You don't seem to be exactly the type to make this guy behave like a human being.
Wouldn't it be kind of naive to assume that when we happen to be born, humanity's got it all figured out for the first time and our intuitions can be trusted? I think it's more reasonable to be on the lookout, actually, for moral blind spots that we've been indoctrinated into not taking seriously. And of course, simply asserting that humans matter more isn't a very compelling argument. The question is, why do humans matter more? And this is really at the heart of the entire debate. Is being human morally relevant? When I ask people why being human is morally relevant, they look at me blankly and say, well, because they're human. I asked my mum this question today. Not joking, she looked me dead in the eye and said, have you been sniffing something in the toilet? But regardless of what I did or did not snort in the toilet today, can we really just say that humans matter more because they're human? Animal ethicists and animal advocates like Peter Singer say no. That doing this is irrational. There is no morally relevant property that is possessed only by the species Homo sapiens, such that we have a rational reason to privilege their interests over and against any others. And to put this idea to the test, I went on the hunt to find someone who was brave enough to try and prove Peter Singer wrong. And not many people wanted to talk about it. Honestly, that much rejection gives me flashbacks to nights out in my hometown.
2 hours later.
But eventually, I did stop getting rejected. I mean, in the park. The club rejections continued. I mean, I wasn't exactly a smooth talker.
We torture animals every day. We don't need to. We do it for taste, pleasure. We don't need to do it.
10 years later.
Do you think that human suffering matters more than animal suffering?
I'm going to go with my gut reaction and go yes.
Anything coming to mind that could back that intuition up, like a reason?
But I guess you're going to save what I guess you can see as yourself and...
As in like, well, they're part of my group. Yeah. I guess someone could say that that's similar reasoning to like a racist or a sexist, right?
Absolutely, I can totally see that. I was about to say, like, then you're getting into
as soon
situations
as you said it, you're like,
where,
if we're not basing who matters morally on who belongs to our group, then what should we base it on?
Oh, this is also what comes to mind is problematic, but I guess what can have the most impact in terms of if we can save one human, then that human can go on to save maybe a few more humans.
The idea is that the human being can become a doctor or like grow up to do something that's meaningful for other sentient beings, other humans, whereas the pig is less likely to do any of that. But then how do we deal with the fact that there are some humans, like some cognitively impaired humans, who will never be able to do that? It could even be arguably like seen as a burden in terms of taking up resources but not really contributing with work. Would we want to say that they matter less?
No. Which is why I started that sentence with this is also problematic.
Can you think of any other reasons why we'd be able to say it's not that bad? It's not as bad as if it were a human?
I guess humans are more intelligent than animals.
Do you think that humans who are less intelligent, like, do you think they matter less? No.
Not at all.
A key part of understanding speciesism is understanding equality. When we say that all humans are equal, regardless of their race, their sex, or their sexuality, what do we mean? I mean, we're not saying that all humans have equal intelligence or equal capacity for moral agency or reciprocity or anything like that, because humans clearly differ in all these capacities. And we're also not saying that all humans should be treated the same. As I said, biological men don't need the right to an abortion. Arguably, what the principle of equality is saying is similar interests should be considered equally. And after spending a couple of days reading about this principle, as well as talking to a few friends, that was helpful.
Now I'm really confused what was the point of this video.
So the point of this video is to explain the concept of speciesism.
No one knows. It sounds like no one knows what it is. It sounds like it's It's just like racism, how no one even like agrees on what racism is. That's a good point, actually. The girl I went on a date with said, she said something, I can't be racist or something, and I was like, what are you talking about? What's a species? Where did that group begin and end?
I think I get it. Let me explain. Okay, can we talk about equality, please? I've been dying to talk about equality all day. I really want to talk about equality. Okay, so imagine I am running a hospital and John comes in. Well, John is very upset because he's got an ingrown toenail. Gross. I'm thinking, I gotta do something for this guy because it's making me suffer just to look at it. But then here's where things get really tricky because Fred comes in and Fred has a stab wound in his stomach. That's also gross. But then my day keeps getting worse and worse and worse because the NHS has got us by the balls and we only have one doctor. I'm thinking, what am I gonna do? I've got to prioritize one of these people. What am I gonna do? Well, I said to John, I said, you and your disgusting toe, they're gonna have to wait because if Fred doesn't see a doctor, then he's probably going to die. And it turns out that prioritizing Fred in this instance does not violate the principle of equality because Fred has a stronger interest in seeing the doctor. But I know what you're thinking because I'm thinking it too. What if I'm in the North Pole with a koala and a polar bear and I only have one spare jacket? Well, after analysing the phenotype of the mammals in question, I would posit that the koala bear would be suffering more from the cold temperature than the polar bear would. And so giving the spare jacket to the koala over the polar bear does not violate the principle of equal consideration of interest because, hello, is anybody in there? The koala has a stronger interest in receiving the jacket. This makes total sense. But now imagine if you're weighing up the interests of a pig with a human. The pig has an interest in not being factory farmed and slaughtered because intense misery and pain kind of sucks, but the human has an interest in eating the pig because he likes the taste of bacon. Well, I think we can all clearly see that in this example, the interest of the pig in avoiding extreme pain and misery outweighs the interests of the human who wants the momentary pleasure of eating a bacon sandwich. And therefore, choosing to favor the interests of the human over the interests of the pig in this example does indeed violate the principle of equal consideration of interests. Thank you. I'm going to have another coffee and come back later. Hello, Jack from the future here. Now, there might be reasons in these hypothetical trade-offs between humans and non-humans that we do tend to prioritize the human. For example, if a human doesn't get treatment for cancer, then we would imagine that's going to harm many other humans who care about that human, and less people are going to care about whether a chicken gets treatment for cancer. So everybody's interests in the scenario should be considered. Now, different cognitive abilities can also play a role here. For example, if I was to be diagnosed with cancer, then I would likely suffer a lot in understanding that diagnosis. Whereas a dog, for example, isn't going to suffer with knowing they have a terminal illness. But in some cases, a lesser cognitive ability means that their interests would be stronger. For instance, if I go for a vaccination, then I can rationalize the pain of the injection. I know it's going to help me. Whereas if we take a dog for an injection, then they're not going to understand why we're putting them through that experience and would likely experience more terror. But ultimately, what matters here are the strengths of the interests. Who's going to suffer more, regardless of the race, sex, gender, or species of the beings in question? Oh, hello. This is kind of close. You have no idea how much I fucked up my hotel room to make these shots. Anyway, one way to think about this is to imagine that you have a 50-50 chance of being born as either the human, who has to go without bacon, or the pig, who is going to be tortured in a factory farm and a gas chamber. When we do this, when we imagine there's a 50-50 chance of us being born into this world as one or the other, we would obviously rather the pig's interests were favoured, because if we happen to be born as the pig, well, that would suck. And if we happen to be born as the human in the world where the pig's interests are favoured, it's not that bad, because you can just eat a different sandwich. And this kind of thought experiment puts us into a position of impartiality. And impartiality is the opposite of a biased perspective. And speciesism is a biased perspective. So part of me just feels like I've spent way too many days just really going down this rabbit hole of speciesism and equal consideration of interests, and I've got this feeling of like overthinking. And so I really want to bring this back and ask, like, why does this really matter? What are the important takeaways here? I mean, if only there was some moral philosopher I could get in touch with who had some kind of habit of talking about the things that really mattered in a very blunt and frank way.
Hello, Jack.
Hello.
Great to see you again.
You too. Long time no see. How are you?
Yes, so long as I don't think about the nature of reality and live in an escapist bubble, I'm fine.
That's my friend David, who's a moral philosopher interested in futurism and the problem of suffering.
What transhumanists focus on is
technical solutions to the problem of suffering.
There aren't a lot of people out there who cut through the intellectual masturbation as well as David, so I asked for his help.
It's easy in a discussion of speciesism to go off into lots of interesting philosophical tangents. If we actually focus on what really matters, that a pig or a cow is kin to a human toddler and infant. One doesn't know how humans, transhumans, 100, 200 years from now will look back on the existing era. Immense systematic lifetime suffering, but also to the sheer triviality of, most people probably still on balance, marginally prefer the taste of, let's say, a traditional hamburger over a veggie burger. But it's incredibly marginal. And that almost trivial difference in preference translates into almost inconceivable suffering. So, that is speciesism at its worst.
Okay, I'm going to have to talk fairly quietly because my flatmates are asleep and it's quite late here. But I just wanted to add some explanation to David's idea that farmed animals are akin to human toddlers or human infants. Like, why does he say that? We tend to care more about our own children compared to other people's children, right? But that's because we're biased. It's not like our children have some objective trait that the other children don't have. And likewise, we also tend to feel more strongly about protecting human children from suffering compared to protecting animals from suffering. But this is despite the fact that the level of suffering they can experience is much the same. Imagine if you had to switch places with either a pig being tortured or a human infant being tortured. Well, it seems there's just no reason to think that you'd be better off being one or the other. Now, some of us might have this intuition that torturing children must be worse than torturing animals. But if we just take a step back and think about the actual capacities of the beings in question, it seems really hard to justify why torturing the toddler would be worse. That just seems really terrifying because it makes it sound like our species bias is preventing us from really seeing something that's as bad, morally speaking, as factory farms and slaughterhouses that are full of miserable, depressed children being tortured and killed. And when you contrast how bad that makes it sound with how media and political debates and like the general public really kind of treat this issue, it's like not taken seriously. I just find that to be a really deeply troubling thought. You might have the intuition to claim that I'm making a false analogy here because human children would grow to become adults and therefore have higher cognitive capacities and long-term goals and things like that. But that doesn't seem to solve the problem for me because then we can just say, okay, then we'll change the analogy. So these are human infants, human toddlers, children, and they're not going to grow up. They would never grow up anyway. They're stuck in childhood. It would still seem fucking grotesquely evil to do to them what we are doing to farmed animals. So, obviously, rejecting speciesism would demand that we abolish the factory farms and slaughterhouses immediately. But rejecting speciesism goes even further than that, because when it comes to human toddlers, we don't just think we ought to avoid harming them. We also think that we're obligated to help them when they're in need.
Yeah, the idea of going out and systematically helping non-human animals in nature makes a lot of vegans uncomfortable. But if you take speciesism and fighting speciesism seriously, that is exactly what we're going to need to do after shutting factory farms and slaughterhouses. Imagine, when we're watching a wildlife documentary and instead of a deer or a zebra, one we're seeing a toddler being mauled, disemboweled, slowly starving to death. Yeah, essentially the level of suffering in nature will shortly be an adjustable parameter. Every single cubic meter of the planet will shortly be accessible to micromanagement and control. The AI revolution we're hearing so much about at the moment is only one part of the story. Essentially, pan-species welfare state could be constructed in our lifetime if enough people recognize it is ethically desirable.
So speciesism is beginning to sound like kind of a big deal. But given how seemingly speciesist our world is, there must be some interesting psychological stuff going on with us. And if we can somehow dismantle our speciesism, will we then have an accurate map of reality when it comes to animals?
There's definitely a lot of evidence, or increasingly evidence, that we do seem to be speciesist, and I'm happy to chat to you about that. But I think there's also kind of just some motivated reasoning going on. Like, if you look at the way the world is set up and the structures that we have in place, there's a lot of reason not to grant moral concern to animals, because then we have to reflect on a lot of the things that we're doing, or in some cases not doing, to recognize their needs. And so I think speciesism is part of it, but it's not the whole story.
That is Mattie Wilkes. She's a psychologist at Edinburgh University, investigating how humans think about morality. So I've been reading a bit about cognitive dissonance, which, as you know, is the mental discomfort that happens when there's a conflict between our beliefs and our actions. And so I'm wondering, does eating animals cause cognitive dissonance?
So one of my favorite studies, the classic study in the field that you teach on this topic, they actually brought people into the lab and they asked them to complete a number of different tasks. One of them was rating the mental attributes of a farmed animal. They then they told them that it was a study about taste, and they told them they would either be sampling, so half the participants would be told they were sampling apple, and the other half were told they would be sampling meat. I think it was beef jerky that they used. And while they were waiting, they asked them to complete a few more tasks, and basically what they find is that people who were anticipating eating meat were more likely to deny mind to animals than those who were anticipating eating apple. And so it shows causally that the anticipation of eating an animal motivates you to deny mind to that animal.
Okay, so you're making it sound like we are deluding ourselves into believing that animals are less sentient and intelligent to feel better about eating them.
Yeah, so because they feel presumably somewhat uncomfortable about the thought of eating something that has a lot of mind, it's easier to just deny that that thing has mind.
I think part of what speciesism is this bias against those who don't belong to our species. And I think this bias we have against other species is one of the reasons why we can learn about the terrible things that's happening to animals and not be horrified.
This is a gas chamber, Pierce.
Well, I know that animals get killed so I can eat pigs.
They're screaming to death.
It's not just speciesism that prevents us from really seeing the significance of the problem of animal suffering. It's also that we're locked into our own egocentric perspectives where we're very focused on our own lives and our own problems, because that's what we're experiencing, that's what's right in front of us, viscerally. And ultimately our brains haven't evolved really to understand the badness of these things, so why would we expect to fully be able to see it from a more impartial standpoint anyway? I mean, it's lucky that we're not able to comprehend the suffering of animals properly, because we would suffer from understanding that. It's all too easy to go in the other direction, where you lose track of the significance and seriousness of what all of this means. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that what's happening seems to be really fucking terrible, and it seems kind of impossible to understand how terrible it really is, given our brains and given the culture that we're in. If there was a house full of people burning down in front of me right now, I wouldn't be able to sit here and chill and call my friend and chat and be silly or think about sex or go on a date. I wouldn't be able to do any of that, because that intense suffering demands urgent action. And the reality is that when you are able to turn off the blinder of speciesism and become aware of what's happening to animals and the suffering they're experiencing, you realize that the house is always burning. There are houses full of beings burning all the time, non-stop, every second and every moment of every day. It's kind of good that we're able to turn away from it, but I'm just very aware that I think most of us, if not all of us, are turning away, myself included, are turning away too often and perhaps never looking for the burning buildings. And it's really, really fucking important that we find the strength and time to look for the burning buildings, because if we don't look for those burning buildings, then we're never going to be able to get the people out. And if you're someone who has got to this point of the video, then you seem to be someone who is looking around for those burning buildings, and for that I am incredibly thankful and happy that you exist.
And maybe it's tempting to throw our hands in the air and say, what's the point? Maybe being completely impartial is an impossible goal. Maybe we'll always be a bit speciesist. But even if that's true, I know I'm not alone in looking at the current situation and thinking, we can do a hell of a lot better than this.